The positive effects of using sawdust have been proven in practice. Wood sawdust has been used to fertilize the soil for a very long time. Wood chips in the garden have long been used as fertilizer, and their advantages do not require additional confirmation. Such wood waste can be used on any type of soil and most horticultural crops. There is a reason for the widespread aversion to sawdust, because crops grown on soil mixed with sawdust usually look as if they were poisoned. The leaves are turning yellow and looking miserable. In fact, the plants are hungry. From a scientific point of view, research and experiments explain that when sawdust, straw or other substance of woody plants comes into close contact with the soil, beneficial bacteria feed on it, multiply heavily, eventually killing the sawdust or other material, to the point where the plants they can feed on it. Unfortunately, this is insufficient, and additional nitrogen should be used until there is no nitrogen left in the soil necessary for the growth of the leaves. This is only a temporary situation, because after the bacteria die, the plants can feed on their nitrogen-filled remains, but it all takes time. When sawdust is placed on the ground as mulch, the bacteria are strongly stimulated, which causes nitrogen depletion. This can be remedied with an additional dose of nitrogen, as in chicken manure. When mixing sawdust with soil, such huge amounts of nitrogen are needed that the process would be completely impractical on a field scale. It also disturbs the structure of light soils and lets too much air into them. Only in the second year after sawdust composting can the plants feed. Although sawdust sometimes gets a bad rap as a nitrogen thief, the truth is that with proper use and management there are many valuable ways to use sawdust in the garden. Nitrogen deficiency is not as much of a problem with sawdust mulching as it is with other uses of sawdust in the garden, because litter settles on the ground surface and is not incorporated into the soil. Still, it can leach some nitrogen from the soil. Thanks to sawdust, water in the soil is retained for longer. Sawdust absorbs moisture and is able to retain it, which is very good in hot and dry periods. In addition, the absorption of excess moisture can protect plants from burning and rotting of the roots. If you use shavings as mulch, it will inhibit the growth of weeds. Sawdust is often used as mulch for berries. In addition to isolating the berries from the ground, sawdust repels pests because they do not tolerate the smell of fresh sawdust. It is a good cold insulation. It is necessary to use sawdust correctly as plant nutrition as well as most fertilizers. Otherwise, they take away all the useful elements and the earth does not receive the necessary compounds. Before using in the garden, sawdust should be composted. This process should last for at least several months and preferably throughout the year. Fresh sawdust contains resins, tannins, and substances that inhibit plant growth. During composting they will be decomposed and washed. During this period the ability of sawdust to retain water and nutrients will also improve. It will not. You can use fresh waste for fertilization because soil oxidation can occur in a short time. In its pure form, shavings are not used because it is not considered fertilizer. Raw and fresh will not only not help garden crops in any way, but will also absorb vitamins, mineral complexes, and other useful micronutrients, and thus only disturb the soil. Sawdust effectively improves the properties of compact and heavy soils. Added in an amount of about 10 liters per square meter and mixed with the soil, it loosens it and aerates it, making the soil more permeable. Remember that sawdust from different trees has different effects on plants. You need to know exactly tree species from which chips are obtained and how to use them properly. Some plant species do not accept deciduous or oak sawdust. The varieties of trees from which sawdust is produced have different effects on the soil structure. Coniferous tree waste is used to increase the acidity of the soil. If necessary, in the case of such garden crops as cucumbers, tomatoes, carrots, they can harm strawberries and raspberries. In the case of sawdust, you can adjust the soil parameters, the pH that is necessary for a given plant. Birch sawdust is often used in mushroom farms. This is due to the fact that oyster mushrooms and mushrooms love hardwood substrates. For this purpose, birch waste is packed into large capacity cellophane bags, then a sufficient number of holes are made for air circulation and then the mushroom spores are colonized. This type of wood contains fungicides that have a beneficial effect on the growth and development of these plants. It helps the gardener reduce the work of weeding beds. This type of wood shavings has many advantages for fruit trees. Sawdust perfectly retains moisture and creates good soil parameters. For such purposes, a layer mulch should be at least 20 centimeters. Pure oak sawdust is never used. It may inhibit the development and growth of some orchard crops. It is best suited for mixed types of compost. So, the sawdust mineral type is designed for use in spring. Such fertilizer with oak waste can saturate the soil with nutrients such as potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen twice as fast as usual. Chestnut sawdust is very valued in gardening. It serves as an insulation that absorbs moisture and prevents the soil from drying out. Moreover, chestnut sawdust can help fight a large number of pests. It has a beneficial effect on the soil, and because of this, a large number of beneficial organisms develop. Pine sawdust contains a large amount of oils and ingredients that acidify the soil. When the plant requires soil with high acidity, drainage and sawdust from this tree will help. They are used for growing potatoes by heating the soil, obtaining a positive effect. In addition, water retention and nitrogen saturation are good for horticultural crops. A mixture of sawdust, ash and manure is used for fertilization. Coniferous sawdust can be used like other sawdust, but it can also be used raw. In autumn, they can be sprinkled with the soil on which garden crops will be planted next year. The layer of embankment should not be more than 3 to 5 centimeters. Such top dressing contributes to the development of microflora in the soil. It attracts earthworms that process the resulting litter. In spring, the planting process in such soil will be much easier because the soil will be loosened. Never use fresh black walnut sawdust wherever you want plants to grow well and develop well. The natural toxins excreted by black walnut kill and prevent plant growth. Using sawdust can make good compost. It is worth highlighting two options for preparing this composition. The simplest is a combination of shavings with cattle and poultry manure. All this is mixed and left to rot. After a year you will get a high-quality substrate filled with carbon. It can be used for 80% of horticultural crops. It is necessary to prepare a pit at least 1 meter deep. Fill it 70-80% with sawdust. The rest should be covered with wood ash. In about 2 years it will be possible to fertilize the soil with this mixture. To improve the quality of the mixture, it should be mixed from time to time. Proper mulching of the soil is not a composting process but a completely different way of fertilizing the soil. Proper preparation of the mulch will give much better results if it is used in the first half of summer. It must be laid between the rows. This method will help your garden crops grow and destroy weeds. It is used for cucumbers and tomatoes. Onions, garlic, carrots, and beets also tolerate shavings as mulch. The only difference is that you need to put it after watering. The principle of operation of such a mixture is the fermentation process that generates heat. Preparation of the mixture is: 3 buckets of fresh sawdust are poured onto the foil. Scatter 200 grams of urea over the entire surface. Add 10 liters of water, then you need add another layer. Number of layers depends on the type of sawdust. At the end of layering, the resulting mass should be covered with foil. It is necessary to minimize the access of oxygen under the foil. After 15 days the composition is ready for use. Depending on the amount of chips, processing time may extend from 20 to 22 days. This form is an excellent mulch for crops with low pH, e.g. strawberries, raspberries, blueberries. It is recommended as a good mulch for asparagus beds as long as care is taken to maintain nitrogen availability. They may appear also problems. The main mistake when using sawdust is to lay it clean on the ground. Even when it is applied between rows, minerals are needed which will get into the ground with dew and rain. The second problem you may encounter is the use of non-aging material as insulation for berry crops. It takes a lot of time to prepare it for use. You can check the material for suitability by color. A dark brown tint is the norm and indicates the readiness of the substance. Sawdust is a very good material for lining garden paths. Sawdust is a much cheaper material than many other materials usually used to build garden paths. A good layer of sawdust on the garden path helps reduce soil erosion, dust, and mud. It also effectively limits the growth of weeds. Unless the path runs directly next to a growing area, this is one place you can use black walnut sawdust in your garden, as it naturally kills and prevents the growth of weeds. If you are in doubt about the closeness, choose sawdust without walnuts instead. The active substance contained in walnut sawdust is called juglone, and over time it will break down in a few months, so you may need to reapply the sawdust to control weeds. Some plants are more susceptible to juglone than others, while tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, peppers, cabbage and a few other herbaceous perennials are quite sensitive to this compound. Others have no effect, if any at all. On the other hand, many common garden vegetables such as pumpkins and other cucurbits tolerate juglone. So do many common stone fruit trees. Sawdust works perfectly as a brown component of compost. Sawdust is considered a brown compost material, which means it is a good source of carbon and carbohydrates, which are food for microorganisms from green raw materials. Both are important components of good compost. Browns and greens are alternated in the compost pile to create the best environment for decomposing a layer of sawdust. Alternating layers of green compost materials such as grass clippings, manure, plant waste, or food waste. You can use sawdust as all or part of the brown material, one for each additional layer of green material. Use sawdust in a 4:1 ratio, for example, use 4 inches of sawdust for every inch of green material. Turn according to your composting schedule. Your compost is ready to use when the sawdust resembles soil and turns black. Sawdust absorbs juices from green materials very well. You can speed up the decomposition of sawdust in your compost pile by keeping the pile moist, so regularly adding water to the pile will help break down the sawdust even more and faster. Adding nitrogen from fertilizer or fish emulsion, for example, can also speed up the decomposition into compost. Since sawdust will be ready before other materials such as cardboard or newspaper, if you have a good and abundant source of sawdust, you may choose to keep paper and cardboard out of your pile, or at least piles that you would like to use sooner rather than later. Mycorrhizal fungi. Mycelium, also called white rot but good rot, effectively increases root surface area through a symbiotic relationship with plants, helping plants, trees, and roots gain access to water and essential symbiotic nutrients. This in turn accelerates plant growth and increases production. Increasingly, mycorrhizal spores are offered for sale by horticultural suppliers, but sawdust can help build these essential fungi naturally and inexpensively. Naturally growing mycorrhizas and mycelium are better than purchased sources because they grow in relation to the growing environment and should therefore be better adapted, with a higher growth rate and survival rate than those that can be purchased. In nature, fruit-bearing trees and orchards rely heavily on mycorrhizas and naturally occurring mycelium. The layer of detritus formed from fallen leaves and rotting wood such as fallen branches provides a good environment in which these symbiotic creatures can thrive. However, in home orchards we often take care of it to keep the areas around our trees clean. When we rake fallen leaves or mow orchards, we often clean the ground in which these organisms naturally grew. However, fruit trees really rely on these tiny networks of fungi to provide the large amounts of nutrients and hydration that large fruit trees need. If you have an orchard and are having difficulty getting good fruit, chances are the problem is a lack of mycorrhizas and mycelium. To increase yields in an orchard by adding mycelium, it is necessary to recreate the environment that allows it to grow. Mulch the area around the base of each tree with a thick layer of sawdust. If you prefer, you can first lay down a weed barrier such as fabric or newspaper or cardboard. Do not throw sawdust over tree trunks, it can choke and kill any type of tree, but in the case of fruit trees it can also cover grafted areas on the trunk. Most fruit trees are grafted trees, so they should be treated in a way that protects the grafted area from being buried. If you notice discoloration, including dark or black sawdust or especially white moldy tape, do not remove it. This is decay and the white is friendly fungi at work. Sprinkle a layer of sawdust every year to suppress weeds and maintain a healthy colonization. The introduction of mycelium and mycorrhizas can have a major impact on fruit yields, and along the way can increase the strength and growth rate of trees. Mulching to increase beneficial fungal growth also has the added benefit of suppressing weeds. This makes mowing and maintaining the orchard easier, especially when the trees grow too large to mow under the branches. Sawdust is a good food for acid-loving plants and trees. Regular use can help maintain a higher level of soil acidity, which will improve the growth and production of these plants. This may include strawberries, evergreens, and conifers, berries, rhododendrons, azaleas and holly. To increase the acidity of the soil, compost is not the best solution because the release of acid from sawdust occurs mainly at the beginning of its decomposition, when the cellulose contained in sawdust decomposes, which is why fresh compost is best. It is worth using sawdust annually at the beginning of the growing season and repeating the application at least once a year. Since the acid release takes a few months off, you may choose to reapply every 3 to 4 months. Use a source of nitrogen if the plants turn yellow and seem to need an additional dose of nutrients. In the vegetable garden, only sawdust from raw wood subjected to the composting process should be used. You must not use sawdust from the remains of furniture and other household items, as it may contain varnishes, glues, paints and other harmful substances. We should also avoid using sawdust from trees that negatively affect other plants, such as walnut and black walnut. Sawdust is a carbon-based material. It needs the help of nitrogen to decompose. Nitrogen comes from the soil or surrounding compost, but sawdust does not retain this nitrogen forever, and when the decomposition process slows and ends, the nitrogen becomes available again in the soil. Although this may take months, do not assume that the nitrogen will be lost forever. It is simply used by sawdust for a relatively short time. Using sawdust does not cause long-term damage to the soil. In fact, it has great benefits in the long run.